In this video, we're going to peek behind the curtain and look briefly at the .NET framework, what it is and how it works and supports your applications. We're also going to talk about namespaces, and we'll look at several of the top .NET Framework class libraries namespaces that you can use within your application to extend its functionality. And then finally, we're going to look at how to navigate through the help system to find more information about classes in the .NET Framework class library. Okay, so what is the .NET Framework? Well, it's difficult to describe, so we're going to stay at a fairly high level in this video. So as a result, this video is probably going to be a lot shorter than the previous ones. Now, if you're really interested about the internals of how the .NET Framework works, what it does for you behind the scenes, there are several really good books that are available that go into a lot of depth on the .NET Framework. And a book is probably the more appropriate format for that type of material because it is more theoretical and less visual. So I would refer you to those. Both of these books are available from the Microsoft Press. They're titled Applied Microsoft .NET Framework Programming, and there's a version for C#, and then there's also a version for Visual Basic .NET. So make sure you get the version that you're most interested in. And I will warn you that this is fairly in-depth information, so it will definitely take you from a beginner to an advanced developer very quickly, but it might be a little confusing in the process. So just fair warning there. But that resource is available to you. Also, I provided a document that accompanies the videos that has some additional information about the .NET Framework and so on. Again, we're going to stay at a fairly high level, so let's talk about the different parts of the .NET Framework. As I've just alluded to, the .NET Framework is actually several things. First of all, you have the Framework Class Library, referred to as the FCL. Secondly, you have the .NET Runtime Host. And then third, there are a bunch of utilities and things that we'll talk about in just a moment. First of all, let's talk about the Framework Class Library, or the FCL. This is actually a series of classes that have methods that encapsulate common system or application-related functionality. Almost everything that's interesting that you'll ever want to do within your applications will require that you use the classes that are supplied within the FCL. Now, we've used the message box, for example. That's in the Framework Class Library. We've used the different controls from the toolbox. That's all contained within the Framework Class Library. If we want to access a database, or if we want to open up an XML file, as we'll do in the next couple of videos, those both require the use of the .NET Framework Class Library. Think of the Framework Class Library as a bunch of classes that are available to your application that you didn't have to write, but you get for free just by virtue of the fact that you're writing a Visual Basic application. There are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of classes, and there's probably no chance that you're going to learn about every single class. But you're going to be able to find out the ones that are most popular, the ones that help you accomplish what you're trying to do most of the time by usually either looking at code examples or reading books, or by using the help system, as I'll show you how to do later on in this video. The next part of the .NET Framework is the .NET Runtime Host. And you can think of this as sort of like a protective bubble that keeps your application and your computer safe. Now, that's really an oversimplification. It does a lot more stuff than that. But, for example, it manages permissions for your application, and these permissions are granted to applications to run on your computer based on where the code originated from, whether the code originated from the local desktop machine, or whether it was run from the internet or run from a corporate intranet. And so in that way, you can prevent certain applications from being executed automatically as you surf to a given website. Those applications may not be given the permission to access your hard drive, for example, but might be able to display a form on the screen. So there's different levels and permissions that are given based on where the code came from, whether or not the code has been signed with a digital certificate, and things of that nature. Also, the .NET Runtime Host provides a common type system across all .NET languages. So you could write a VB.NET application that can reference code that's written in a C# application, and so on. And that's fairly unique. That's not something that just comes automatically with any programming language. It took a lot of forethought and a lot of effort to make that happen. And then also, the .NET Runtime host makes sure that no memory is leaked. In other words, no memory is left over once your application has terminated, or as your application finishes using references to variables and references to objects, it will clean up the memory, and so you don't have to worry about it. And then third, you have a set of utilities that come with the .NET framework. And these utilities include compilers, debugging tools, tools that automatically produce certain types of code or XML, and really there's so many different utilities it's difficult to put them into one container or another. Most of these tasks that you perform using these utilities are not something that you really need to worry about for the moment since you're just getting started, so we're not going to cover them in any detail at all in this series of lessons. However, if you open up Windows Explorer and you navigate to Windows/Microsoft.net/framework/version 2.0. whatever is the extended version on the end, you can see that if you were to sort the applications or the files by type, there's a number of different .exe applications that are available, and all of these are the types of utilities that are accessible through the .NET framework. Okay, so now let's talk about how the .NET applications work. Whenever you create an application and you create an executable like we saw in the very first video where we identified where the .exe file was saved in the bin directory, what actually happens behind the scenes? How does the .NET Framework Runtime, for example, support your application? So that's what we're going to talk about now. First of all, whenever you compile your application, it creates what's called an assembly. An assembly is usually a file with a .exe extension or a .dll extension. And the code that's contained within this file is called intermediate language, or rather IL. It's a temporary language that will be compiled a second time whenever your application is installed on its target computer. So for example, if you were to create a .exe application and give it to a friend, and they're running Windows 98, it's going to then, the first time the application is run, compile a special version of your application using the .exe assembly, using the intermediate language inside that assembly, that is specific to not only Windows 98, but also the specific processor and the amount of memory and things of that nature. It tweaks the application to perform optimally on that system. If you were to give the application then to a different friend, it would go through that same compilation step where it determines the operating system, the processor, and other features about that person's system, and compiles a version of the application for use on that computer. This is called just-in-time compilation, and it's a unique feature of the .NET framework, and it's something that allows your applications to run smoothly regardless of the operating system, as long as it's Windows-based, regardless of the processor speed and things of that nature. The application will be tuned up automatically without you having to do anything about it, so that it runs as best it can on that person's computer. Now, when that person actually tries to execute the application the first time, it goes through this just-in-time compilation step. And then all subsequent times, what will happen is it will use that optimized version of the assembly in order to run from that point on. So that compilation step only happens once. When the application is running, the runtime, the .NET runtime, will host the assembly. Now, what does it mean to host the assembly? Again, that's a little bit difficult thing to explain because it does a lot of things. Some of the things that we described earlier, where it protects the computer from memory leaks, protects the computer from malicious code that might be written based on the credentials of where the application was originally launched from, and looks for security violations and things of that nature. The runtime also provides access to the framework class library so that the application can access the file system if it needs to, or access a database, and all the things that the FCL will allow the application to do. So the runtime provides access to those classes. And then, like we talked about earlier, whenever object references and variables are no longer needed, those items are removed automatically from memory by a special feature of the .NET Runtime host called the garbage collector. So it goes around and looks for things that are no longer being used, and it removes them from memory. And so you don't have to worry about cleaning up memory or anything of that nature like programmers in the past had to do. That's all taken care of for you. So you can just concentrate on creating the core functionality of your application. Now again, all of this functionality is provided for you without you having to explicitly call the runtime. When somebody tries to execute your application on their computer, the .exe file will tell the computer that it requires the .NET runtime in order to run. And if the user doesn't have the runtime, then they'll get an error message on their screen that telling them that it requires the use of the .NET runtime, and I think it even gives them the location where they can download the runtime so that they can run the application. If they've been keeping their Windows their version of Windows updated with the latest security patches, they should have the most recent version of the .NET Framework runtime. However, when you create an installation program that places your program on the user's hard drive and creates a nice little icon in their start menu, the install program that you create with Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition can also include the .NET runtime. So if a user doesn't have the particular version of the runtime that you compiled your application with, then it could be installed during the installation routine for your application. Now, if the user already has the .NET runtime on their system, then your application will just simply execute. So it's not really crucial at this point that you understand everything about the .NET runtime or really any part of the .NET framework at first since you're just getting started. But just understand that there's this whole support system that really won't allow your application to fail or even to break somebody else's computer, which is a fairly comforting thought. Now we're going to completely switch gears and begin to talk about namespaces. As a Visual Basic developer, namespaces are a little more transparent to you than, say, somebody who's currently learning about C#. However, namespaces are ever present behind the scenes without you perhaps realizing that they even exist until now. Now, we've noted in the previous lesson that fields, properties, and methods must live within the context, or rather within the code block of a class. But classes must live within the context or the code block of a namespace. Now, while this isn't readily apparent at first, if we take a look at the property pages by right-clicking on our project name within the Solution Explorer and selecting Properties, you can see that in the upper right-hand corner of the Application tab of our property pages for our current project called Lesson7 that there's something called a root namespace, which in this case is identical to the project name. So all classes that we create in our project live within the namespace Lesson7 in this particular instance. Now the purpose of a namespace is that it helps you write code to avoid naming conflicts. And let me explain what that means. Suppose you work at a big company. In particular, let's use the previous lesson's example of an auto manufacturer. And you work there and you create applications for the finance department within that auto manufacturer. Now another programmer at that same company, he happens to work in the engineering department, and for years you're both developing .NET applications and you've both created a car class. Now your car class looks dramatically different than his car class. But one day you're asked by management to work together to build a new application that merges both departments. And you realize that you've got a lot of the code already written, but one big problem exists. Since you both have a car class, .NET may not know which car class to use. Each car class has a different properties and methods defined, so using the wrong car class might, blow up the application. So what do? Well, fortunately, as long as you use different namespaces, you're going to be okay. For example, you might have the following namespace: Great Cars. Maybe that's the name of your company. GreatCars.finance, which is your department, .car. And your counterpart's namespace, who happens to work in engineering,